The rain hadn't let up since dawn, and by the time we stepped out of St. Matthew's Church, the gray Charleston sky felt like it had settled into my bones. Arthur Rowan had been more than my grandfather. He'd been the steady voice in a life that had too often been ruled by sharp words and colder silences. The service was quiet, dignified, filled with faces from the community he'd built so much for. My father, Malcolm, stood front and center, accepting condolences like a politician on election night. His handshakes were firm, his smile measured. I thought maybe, for once, grief had softened him. That hope didn't last long. Hours later, the mourners gone, the scent of damp flowers still heavy in the air, I found myself in the estate's drawing room. I was sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at the old oak mantel where Arthur used to rest his arm when telling me one of his stories. Malcolm walked in, his expression stripped of the polite mask he'd worn all day. "It's done," he said flatly. "The estate transfer is official. 400 million. Locked in my name." He said it like a man announcing the weather, then let a small smirk curl his mouth. I nodded slowly, unsure what he expected me to say. He didn't give me the chance. "You're useless now." The words hung there, too absurd to register at first. "Excuse me." "You've coasted long enough," he said, his tone cutting clean through the air. "Pack your things. I want you out of the house by morning. For a moment." I couldn't feel my hands. This was my father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd lectured me about ambition, now looking at me like I was a piece of unwanted furniture. I stood, forcing my spine straight even as my chest tightened. Fine. My voice didn't shake. I wouldn't give him that. I walked out of the room, the echo of my footsteps following me down the long hall toward the bedroom that had never really felt like mine. I grew up in a house where silence was a form of control. Malcolm's rules were precise and absolute: no slammed doors, no talking back, and never, under any circumstance, challenge his decisions. My earliest memories of him are measured in corrections: posture too slouched, tone too sharp, ambitions too unrealistic. By the time I was 10, I'd learned to keep my victories to myself. If I brought home an A, he'd ask why it wasn't an A+. If I won an award, he'd wonder aloud how many other kids hadn't bothered to compete. Praise was rare, and when it came, it felt more like a footnote than a celebration. Arthur was different. My grandfather's presence was like stepping into a warm patch of sunlight after being indoors too long. He didn't push me to be perfect. He asked me what I wanted and then listened, really listened to the answer. When I was 15, I told him I wanted to work in finance, to understand the currents that moved money and power. Malcolm scoffed, called it a man's world. Arthur just smiled and told me to learn everything I could. Years later, when I was accepted into a competitive graduate program, Malcolm dismissed it as a waste of time and money. I remember sitting on the porch with Arthur that night, my acceptance letter in my lap, wondering if I should turn it down. He sipped his sweet tea, then quietly slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check large enough to cover my tuition for the first year. "Don't tell him," Arthur said. "This is between us. Consider it an investment in someone worth investing in." That was Arthur believing in me when it cost him something. Now, standing in my childhood bedroom with a half-packed suitcase, I thought of that night and the quiet pride in his eyes. Malcolm could strip me of this house, but he couldn't erase the foundation Arthur had given me. As I reached for another hanger, something hard shifted inside the lining of my old bookshelf. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. Within days of the funeral, the warmth Arthur had brought to the estate seemed to evaporate, replaced by something sharper, colder. Doors that had always been left open were now locked. The library, the sunroom, even the small study where Arthur kept his records, each handle rattled uselessly when I tried it. The staff, people I'd known for years, avoided my eyes. Margaret, the housekeeper who used to sneak me scones from the kitchen, gave only curt nods now, her hands busy with tasks that didn't need doing. When I asked if something was wrong, she murmured, "Mr. Rowan's instructions," before hurrying away. At dinner, Malcolm spoke as if I weren't there. He discussed moving forward with an air of finality, talking about renovations, new investments, and streamlining the household in ways that made it clear I wasn't part of his plans. His voice carried the satisfaction of someone cutting away what he considered dead weight. Back in my room, I tried to focus on packing. My fingers skimmed along the spines of books I'd kept since high school, comfort in a time when I'd needed safe places to hide my thoughts. One, a thick biography Arthur had given me on my 18th birthday, slid forward more easily than the others. When I pulled it free, something small and firm shifted inside. I flipped it open and found a sealed envelope tucked deep between the last few pages. My name, in Arthur's steady hand, stood out against the cream paper. I sat on the edge of the bed, tearing the seal with careful fingers. Inside was a single piece of stationery, the ink faint but deliberate. The will protects those who protect others. No explanation, no context, just that one line, weighty enough to stop me cold. I read it again, tracing the words as if more meaning might appear. Arthur had hidden it for me to find not Malcolm, not anyone else. I folded the note back into the envelope and slid it into my bag, my mind already turning over what it could mean. Malcolm's study smelled faintly of cigar smoke and polished leather, the same as it had when Arthur used it, only now the warmth was gone. Malcolm sat behind the heavy mahogany desk, leaning back in Arthur's old chair as though it had always belonged to him. A crystal tumbler of bourbon rested at his elbow, half full, catching the light from the desk lamp. "Sit," he said, not looking up from the papers in front of him. I didn't move until he finally raised his eyes, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose you've heard," he began, as though the whole city wasn't already buzzing. 400 million. All mine. Arthur was generous. His voice carried no trace of grief, only the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a game they'd stacked in their favor. I stayed quiet, letting him fill the air. "You've had a long, comfortable stay here." "Callista," he continued, his tone shifting to something colder. "But you're not a child anymore. You're a financial burden. And frankly, you've been coasting." He said it like a verdict, not an opinion. I almost laughed. I'd been working since I was 16, paying my own way through most of grad school thanks to Arthur. Not him, but arguing now would be like shouting into the wind. "I want you out by morning," he said, leaning forward. Elbows on the desk. No drama, no drawn-out goodbyes. This is my house now, and I decide who belongs here. His gaze lingered on me, waiting for the crack, the flinch, the desperate protest. I felt the weight of Arthur's note in my pocket, the words burning against my leg. The will protects those who protect others. I straightened my shoulders. Fine. No tremor in my voice, no hesitation. I rose, turned, and walked out without another word. Upstairs. I finished packing the last of my clothes into the worn leather suitcase Arthur had given me years ago. The envelope stayed in my coat pocket, as if moving it might weaken whatever strength it had given me in that room. By the time the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9, my bags were by the door. I didn't look back when I stepped outside into the cool Charleston night. By the next afternoon, I was hauling my suitcase up the narrow staircase of a brick walk-up in downtown Charleston. The apartment was barely big enough for me to stretch my arms without touching both walls, but it was mine, no locked doors, no eyes watching to see if I measured up. I'd sold a few pieces of jewelry Malcolm had given me over the years, gifts more for show than sentiment. The cash wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the deposit and my first month's rent. My job as a financial analyst let me work remotely, So I set up my laptop on the little kitchen table and kept my hours steady, forcing normalcy into the chaos. Still. At night, I'd catch myself pulling the envelope from my coat pocket, rereading Arthur's words. The will protects those who protect others. It didn't sound like something he'd say casually, and it certainly didn't sound like a message meant for Malcolm. I started digging quietly public records, probate filings, even old news articles about estates with unusual clauses. Most of it was noise, but every so often, I'd find something that made my pulse jump. Trusts that released funds only under specific conditions. Wills tied to joint ventures or community projects. Arthur had been meticulous in everything he did. It was possible, maybe even likely, that his will carried the same precision. 3 days after I moved in, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me swipe to answer. Callista Rowan. The voice was crisp, professional, with an undercurrent of dry amusement. Yes, this is Evelyn Cole. I was your grandfather's attorney. A pause. Deliberate. We should talk about his will. It's unusual. There was a flicker of satisfaction in her tone, like she was holding back from saying more until we were face to face. I sat up straighter. How unusual, she gave a short, knowing laugh. Let's just say your father's week is about to get a lot more complicated. Can you come to my office tomorrow? I glanced at the envelope on the table, my mind already racing ahead. Evelyn Cole's office was nothing like I expected. No polished mahogany or antique rugs, just clean lines, muted colors, and a wall of neatly labeled files. She gestured for me to sit across from her desk, then folded her hands, studying me with the kind of look that says she already knows more than she's letting on. I've been waiting for you to call, she began. Your grandfather anticipated certain dynamics in this family. I arched a brow, meaning my father, meaning exactly your father, she said, pulling a thick binder toward her. Arthur placed his estate everything in a trust. Malcolm cannot access a cent of the $400 million unless specific conditions are met. I leaned forward, pulse quickening. What conditions? Her lips curved slightly, like she'd been waiting for that question. He must complete a community redevelopment project that meets city approval and Arthur's philanthropic standards, and he must do it with you as co-executor. Equal authority. Equal signature rights. I sat back, trying to process. You're saying he can't do it without me? Correct. There's more. She continued. During the 12 months it takes to complete the project, there can be no lawsuits between you and Malcolm, no public estrangement, and no formal withdrawal from the arrangement by either party. Any violation, and the trust dissolves, and the money Evelyn flipped to the final page of the clause. Half would go to the charities Arthur named, the other half directly to you. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint hum of the air conditioner. I thought about Malcolm in his study, smug and certain he'd already won. I thought about him telling me I was useless. Arthur really planned this, I murmured. He wanted to ensure the person he trusted most was in a position to protect his legacy. Evelyn said, and that person wasn't your father. I traced my fingers along the edge of the desk. A slow, deliberate motion. When does Malcolm find out? Evelyn's smile widened. Just slightly. He already has. I felt the shift in my chest anticipation, steady and cold. Then I suppose I should be expecting a knock at my door. It didn't take long. Less than 24 hours after leaving Evelyn's office, there was a sharp knock on my apartment door when I opened it. Malcolm stood there expensively dressed, but the edges frayed. His face was pale, a faint sheen of sweat along his hairline. Callista, he said, forcing a smile. Thought we should talk? Family to family? I stepped aside without a word, letting him into the cramped living room. He glanced around, eyes lingering on the second-hand furniture like it was a personal insult. The bank tells me there's been a misunderstanding, he began, settling onto the sofa. Funds are tied up in some sort of trust. Ridiculous red tape. His tone was light, but I could hear the strain under it. It's not a misunderstanding. I said, it's the will. He waved a dismissive hand. Your grandfather was sentimental. I'm sure we can work around it. He leaned forward, softening his voice. You and I, blood is blood. We've had our differences, but we can come together now. Make this work for both of us. Arthur's words flickered in my mind. Don't react. Negotiate. What exactly are you proposing? I asked evenly. That you sign whatever's needed so I can move forward. You'll get something. Of course. I held his gaze. That's not how it's written. His smile thinned. Callista. I'm offering you a way to make this painless. You think you can run a multi-million-dollar project without me? You'll sink us both. The threat was there, coiled under the words. But I didn't flinch. If you want the money, I said, you'll follow the terms. All of them. A muscle in his jaw twitched. For a moment, I thought he might explode, but instead he stood, straightening his jacket. Think about it, he said, and walked out without another glance. I closed the door behind him, already knowing I wouldn't need to. He'd be back. 2 days after our first meeting, I had the agreement ready. Evelyn had helped me refine it, each clause crafted with the same precision Arthur had used in his will. Malcolm would publicly acknowledge me as co-executor, cover my living costs for the duration of the project, and transfer 3 specific estate properties into my name, outright no conditions, no reversals. When I slid the document across Evelyn's conference table, Malcolm's eyes skimmed it, then flicked up to me. You can't be serious. Every word, I said. He leaned back, crossing his arms. I'm not signing this. You're extorting me. I didn't blink. The will is extorting you. I'm just giving you a way forward. For the next week. He stalled, claimed he was busy with other matters, sent back pages with red ink scrawled across the margins, even consulted another lawyer, a sharp-suited man who lasted 1 meeting before quietly confirming the truth Arthur's language was airtight. Without my cooperation, Malcolm's $400 million might as well have been buried in the ground. When he finally returned to Evelyn's office, he was quieter. Not defeated. Exactly, but there was a weight in his posture, a tightness around his mouth. He picked up the pen, rolled it between his fingers, and signed each page with quick, sharp strokes. Evelyn notarized it, her expression neutral, though I caught the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. Malcolm pushed the signed packet toward me, his knuckles white. I hope you know what you're doing. Callista. I do, I said, tucking the agreement into my folder. We stood, the air between us heavy with everything unspoken. He left without shaking my hand, the door clicking shut behind him. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift not just in paperwork, but in power, and it was only the beginning. The waterfront lot had been little more than a patch of cracked asphalt and weeds when we began. Arthur's plans called for something alive, glass walls opening to the harbor, classrooms for job training, and space for local markets on weekends. From the first week, I made it my business to know every detail. I walked the site with the contractors each morning, reviewed invoices at night, and built relationships with the city officials whose signatures we needed. The more I showed up, the more the crews looked to me for decisions. Malcolm hated it. He showed up late to meetings, floated ideas to trim the budget that ignored both code and Arthur's vision. Whenever I refused, he muttered about me being impossible to work with. But he never tried to shut me out. He couldn't. The will made sure of that. The press loved the story Rowan Family Unites to honor Patriarch's dream. They photographed us side by side, smiling for the cameras. In the glossy spreads, we looked like a team. Behind those smiles, every conversation was a negotiation. By month 11, the center's steel frame was complete, glass panels catching the morning sun. Malcolm stood with me on the balcony overlooking the water, watching crews set the final supports. "You've handled yourself better than I expected," he said, the words clipped but genuine. "Better than you wanted." "Maybe," I replied. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Maybe. It wasn't trust, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was an acknowledgement, however grudging, that I wasn't the liability he'd painted me to be. And in a few weeks, the project would be finished, and the will's conditions met. The ribbon cutting drew a crowd large enough to spill onto the sidewalks. City leaders, reporters, and families from the neighborhood gathered under a bright spring sun, the new community center gleaming behind us. Malcolm stood to my left, hands clasped, smile practiced. The cameras loved him, but the speeches weren't his to give. That was Arthur's stipulation and mine. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the podium. I spoke about Arthur's belief that wealth meant little if it didn't lift others. I thanked the contractors, volunteers, and the community who'd worked alongside us. I didn't mention Malcolm. The applause started slow, then built into something steady and warm, rolling over the courtyard. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Malcolm's expression tighten, his jaw set as the focus stayed on me. By the end of the day, the trust's conditions were fulfilled. Malcolm would have his fortune. I had something different, 3 prime estate properties in my name, and the public credit for bringing Arthur's vision to life. As the crowd dispersed, I slipped away down the side path, my heels clicking against the new brickwork. The center stood behind me, alive with voices, exactly as Arthur had imagined. I didn't look back at Malcolm. I didn't need to. I'd taken the part of my family's legacy worth keeping and left the rest in the past.